Well, good afternoon. My name is Brian Kane. I'm the publisher here at Xconomy. As I hope you all know, Xconomy focuses on engaging life science leaders and innovators at the intersection of science and technology. Our mission via our daily newsletter, Accelerating Life Science Events and Awards programs, is to connect the funding partnerships, technologies, and the science necessary to support and enhance the successful development of novel therapeutics. I'm happy to welcome you and over 150 of your colleagues today to today's presentation, Digitalization of the Regenerative Medicine Supply Chain, which is brought to you by Global OT/IT Quality Services. As we know, as an industry, traditional pharma and biologics have one of the more complicated supply chains. With the rapid maturation and personalization of medicines, especially cell and gene therapies, it's imperative the industry adopt a digital solution approach where track and trace is key. Today, we're going to spotlight Global OT/IT's work to create an integrated software platform that meets clients' need requirements by incorporating the best of the best in applications. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. If you have any technical difficulties during today's session, please press the help button on your player console to receive assistance in solving common issues. And this is an interactive event, so we welcome all of your questions. In order to submit a question, all you have to do is type your question into the window on the left-hand side of your screen and then hit the submit button. We'll be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session following the main presentation, but please feel free to send in your questions at any time and we'll add them to the queue. If at any time you're having audio difficulties or advancing of the slides, simply hit your F5 button to refresh your webcast console. And please be aware that today's session is being recorded and will be available on Xconomy's website, xconomy.com, beginning tomorrow for your review. You'll be notified via email when the on-demand presentation is available. So without further delay, I'm happy to introduce today's presenter. Bob Lechich is the Principal Manufacturing and Supply Chain Consultant with Global OT/IT Quality Services. Bob, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And good afternoon, good morning, good evening to the folks online. Maybe there are some people in different time zones. The topic of digitalization of the regenerative supply chain is very timely, I think. There's much going on in industry as well as in other areas like academia and research, medical research areas. So hope this will be interesting to you. This is based on some research that I have done, but also some practical experiences in the consulting engagements that I've had over the last year. So hopefully this will resonate with many of the folks online. The agenda, I wanted to just cover the science behind regenerative medicine very briefly. Some folks may be very familiar with it. Some folks are just beginning to get involved with it. Want to talk about a little bit about what the regenerative medicine business looks like and where it may be going. I also like to cover some critical requirements and challenges of the regenerative medicine supply chain. Talk about a concept of an ecosystem that models the supply chain. And then we get into digitalization, its benefits, what a supply chain should look like from a digitalization standpoint, and how does digitalization really apply to regenerative medicine. So the science, right? This is a very complex topic, a lot of things going on, but just some terminology, hopefully to get people acclimated. Regenerative medicine involves the use of body cells to replace, regenerate, or rejuvenate tissue, organs, and other bodily elements. So this is a pretty wide term. We've heard cell and gene therapy, but we're also the terminology of tissue engineering is brought into this. And as you can see with the European Union, they have a term called ATMP, Advanced Therapy Medical Products, which covers all those areas. Specifically on cell therapy, we use viable cells, which are either injected, crafted, or implanted into a patient in order to have a medicinal effect. A couple of terms here that folks tend to use to describe their products: autologous and allogeneic. Autologous products are products that you retrieve cells from a specific patient, modify them, grow them ex vivo, and then insert them back into the same patient. But allogeneic gives us the opportunity to have donor cells that can go out to multiple patients. So we'll talk a little bit about some examples, but certainly some of the products that have been approved here in the U.S. recently are mostly autologous. We've also probably heard the phrase CAR T cells, which is certainly one of the main highlights currently of commercial products that are being made in industry. But there are other cells that are able to be used: natural killer cells, stem cells in general. Stem cells are cells that are very strong interest to researchers because they can be differentiated into multiple different types of cells, whether they be liver cells, kidney cells, even neural cells. So there's a lot of terminology out there, but I just wanted to kind of frame us in that context. Gene therapy products are products that are specifically replacing genes in patient cells, either by the use of transfection, which is a non-viral approach, or transduction, which is a viral methodology. We hear a lot about viral vector technology out there. So the intent there is that we could use vectors to bring in those genes into the cells, and then these cells are injected and they basically grow and multiply in the body, producing the effect from the genes that we've inserted in those cells. The third category, which we'll think a little bit about, but hopefully more to come as more products are getting approved, is tissue engineered products. And tissue engineered products are a little bit different because what we're talking about here is replacing larger amount of cells or tissues to replace portions of an organ or the organ itself, typically grown ex vivo and then placed in vivo into the body. So, for example, there are research going on right now in clinical studies for artificial pancreas cells that are placed in a semipermeable membrane that is placed into the body. And those cells, those pancreatic islet cells, are able to perform similarly to your natural cells in the body for glucose metabolism. And so we'll hear more about that in the future, but I think we'll probably focus mostly on the first two categories because that is probably where the supply chain will have the biggest impact over the next few years. Here are just some examples of some products. One of the first products, Provenge, was out there for a while. It was a prostate cancer drug. It was autologous. Currently, Chimera and Yescarta are both autologous that are right now have been in the market for a little bit. Disease categories for AL and large beta cell lymphoma, respectively. And I thought to add one additional tissue engineered product, which is it was allogeneic, Apligraf. And some people may know about this. This is where you actually tissue slices are actually placed on the leg for venous leg ulcers and diabetic foot ulcers. So we have, some examples of tissue engineering, and much of our discussion today would apply to those products also. So what does the regenerative medicine business look like today, right? For some people, they think that this just happened yesterday, but actually cell therapy started in the early 1970s, and gene therapy trials actually started in the 90s. So there's been a significant amount of time between the concepts of these therapies and where we are today. From a clinical study standpoint, there are over 1,000 studies currently in progress. So there's a lot of activity that requires manufacturing and supply chain to get the products to the patients. Products developed. A large percentage of these types of products are being developed in academia, medical research centers, as well as biopharmaceutical firms. The distribution of these areas, I think, is important because when we get into the discussion of the ecosystem, much of the manufacturing that's currently being done is in those research centers and academic institutions. In addition, there are currently 17 approved cell and gene therapy products in the U.S. And obviously, Chimera and Yescarta are probably the two more well-known products that are available. Dr. Gottlieb from the FDA is estimating that we could have 10 to 20 new cell and gene therapy products by 2025, which is a significant increase. The market could potentially reach $35 billion by 2026, according to McKesson. We've also seen a significant amount of mergers and acquisitions in the industry. Examples include Celgene with BMS, Avexis with Novartis, and Kite with Gilead, but there's many others out there that are occurring or in progress. The one other thing that we should keep in mind here is that due to a lot of the issues around manufacturing, supply chain, and also the product characteristics, the industry is struggling with supporting the costs of these cell and gene therapies. Commercial products are being priced at, around $475,000 per treatment, depending on the type of cancer. This is a significant number, right? And the payers and the insurance models are having, to be frank, a very tough time with these numbers. And so I think there's great emphasis for us to reduce the COGS or the pricing of the drugs or the medicinal products. And so we are very challenged in how to make that happen in the supply chain. I also kind of wanted to put a little bit of a position of where traditional pharmaceuticals are versus regenerative medicine products. From a customer base, traditional pharmaceutical products, biopharmaceutical, large number of units, right? Millions of vials or tens of millions of vials of tablets. Regenerative medicine is a little bit different because it's typically small volume units that could be even patient specific. So you're talking about a single unit of product that would be representative from the batch that you would make in manufacturing that will be sent to a infusion center to be issued to a patient. So you could have single units, if you will, of product. From a product technology standpoint, the technology for traditional pharmaceuticals has been small and large molecule, but regenerative medicine is cell and tissue based. So we're dealing with living cells. We're talking about cells that have to be preserved and stay viable throughout the supply chain into the patient infusion center or the administrative place where the product will be used. The treatment approach, kind of important here too. Pharmaceuticals have traditionally been relieving or controlling symptoms for the most part. Some products have been curative, very few. But the mainstay for regenerative medicine is that we're looking to have a single or multiple doses that will ultimately cure the patient, at least in theory. This is yet to be seen, but that is the intent for us to provide living cells that would replace the functionality that is not working correctly in the human body. From a product lifecycle management standpoint, the pharmaceutical industry has been traditionally incremental innovation, one-upsmanship with products to a competitor, but eventually we have this generic replacement, right, built into our filings. That's a little bit different with regenerative medicine because we're talking about a very disruptive innovation, something that really isn't clearly understood yet completely in terms of its life cycle. but it's really a very different approach. We're jumping the level of capability to influence the patient's illness, and as I said earlier, with the intent to cure. From a manufacturing perspective, most of the traditional pharmas have been made in large plants, very much a pharmaceutical firm-centric approach, right? Where we make a large number of units in a batch. The batch is then packaged and sent out through the supply chain. Regenerative medicine is quite different, notably small scale. We'll talk about scale up versus scale out and how we would be able to increase the number of units made, but typically we're very small scale, laboratory oriented to a large degree. Usually we have smaller distribution sites, in some cases direct to the patient, as well as near patient treatment centers. So what that means is, and this is again fundamentally a very different concept, is that you put the manufacturing of the product in the hospital or in the research center very close to the patient. There are some thoughts on that. Obviously, economics is an issue, and support from the various support groups like quality need to be dealt with, but there are that kind of business model is being explored. So from a supply chain standpoint, traditional pharmaceuticals are typically made to stock, right? Through our distribution centers or wholesalers, you hold so much inventory for 6 months of stock that can be distributed out to your customers downstream. The regenerative medicine business is very different. It's all made to order for the most part right now. Allogeneic will move us closer to the pharma model, but that's yet to be seen. But the key here is how quickly we can make the product and get it to the treatment facility quick as possible. In some cases, we see that the cycle time or the lead time of the supply chain is in days. Some companies want, no more than 20, 21 days, but and that varies. But clearly, there is a time constraint there that needs to be dealt with in the supply chain. So some critical requirements of the supply chain: sufficient number and optimal location of qualified treatment centers, both on the donation side as well as on the treatment side downstream. Those are really critical to the supply chain for regenerative medicines. Also, sufficient manufacturing capacity to accommodate those orders. If you're making one batch per patient and you have a significant increase in the number of patients, you can see your batch increase being significant. Logistics operations to ensure timeless security and chain of custody and controlled environments. So we have to, as I said earlier, time is a concern in large cases, but we also have to be concerned to make sure that we're keeping a chain of custody throughout the manufacturing, logistics, and delivery to the patient facility. Some of these products will obviously have low temperature requirements, maybe humidity, light, and other special requirements that have to be managed in that supply chain. We also have to integrate patient activities with the manufacturing logistics. So let's face it, the patients that would be taking these products are ill. They may not necessarily arrive at the scheduled time for their injection and or their blood collection, for example. So the scheduling of batches will be very much dependent upon that schedule of patient activities. Very different than what we see in traditional pharma. And we also have to maintain regulatory and quality requirements like GMPs, good tissue practices, and good distribution practices. Some of the challenges that we see in the supply chain, these new business models are very interesting, right? The fact that we may have a vein to vein, which really means that we have a patient donate their blood, it gets processed, and then sent back to that same patient. So this vein-to-vein concept has very big implications to how the supply chain is designed and executed. As I said earlier, near-patient manufacturing is also a concern. How do you distribute your manufacturing in a decentralized approach, potentially at the treatment center? And we'll talk more about that a little later. And obviously, reducing cost of goods sold. That is a very big area of interest. Donor patient cell collection, right, the beginning of the harvesting of the cells. Understanding true demand, right? In traditional pharma, we develop a forecast, right, that says how many units we're going to need on a monthly, quarterly basis, yearly, etc. Here, we're dealing with demand that's being driven by a patient request. And so there is a concern of what is that true demand? How many patients should we be supporting? Ultimately, the patient request is still individually addressed by the batches that we make. But again, is it a forecast or is it really going to be a true demand? The other aspect that the patient cells do for us from a supply chain perspective is it provides variability. The word variability, everyone knows, not something that we want to hear about, but the fact is that each patient's cells could be very different. And when we process those cells, we may get different impact to the process. It may change the results of what comes out of the manufacturing process, and it may also impact ultimately how many cells get back to the patient for treatment. So variability of the patient is something that we're dealing with, and we need to have more analytics around understanding what that variability means to the process. From a process development manufacturing, there's a long list here, but try to go through them quickly. Variability of donor cells, as I said, increase in capacity. How do we do that? There's a couple different ways that we've seen. Scale up, which would require to use the same equipment but at a larger volume. But for most part, the autologous products have seen more scale out, meaning that you repeat a number of different manufacturing suites with the appropriate equipment to increase the number of batches that you make. And that right now is driving a lot of the facility design, locations of manufacturing. A lot of the CMOs are designing their facilities with that higher manufacturing suite capability for scale out. As I said earlier, modalities of manufacturing, we typically have seen some large central facilities being built around the world, but we also have seen some regional to support more rapid delivery of the product from a lead time standpoint, and as I mentioned, near patient. We also have to consider the make or buy decisions with CMOs. For the most part, because of the types of customers that are building developing product, they are looking for CMOs to help deliver the clinical batches. But as products get closer to commercial, that decision of whether to make it internally or go stay with contractors is a big question that needs to be answered. Process understanding, right? We're dealing with molecular biology to understand how to grow the cells and maintain cell quality. So QBD with appropriate critical quality attributes and critical process parameters is a methodology that's being used or attempting to be used, and that also impacts the development time. Another thing that we have to be concerned with is the variability of the manual processes that we typically see in manufacturing. These processes are very akin to laboratory activity, because of the small scale that we're talking about. And a lot of folks are looking at trying to close their processes, standardize them in such a way that it's automated, in such a way that manual intervention is minimized or eliminated. Tech transfer product characteristics are also important because if you start out with a particular site or firm to make the product, transferring it to another could be very challenging. I akin this to a little bit with my work that I've done in biologics, with traditional pharma. The phrase we typically use was the product is the process, right? And so changing the process in any way changes the product. And that's due to our fact that we don't understand well enough those CQAs and CPPs and their relationship. So we need to be careful that if we do end up working at one firm for manufacturing, how well can we replicate that or expand it to other sites? With allogeneic products, the ability to have master cell banks and working cell banks is another consideration. That, again, is leaning more towards the traditional biopharma. I've talked about the closed unit, and then viral process development and overall capacity is definitely one of those things that we're seeing in the industry that's of concern because we need that to be able to do the genetic manipulation. Procurement, I think, is another perspective that's not always appreciated, but it's very important. The planning long lead times and replenishment policies need to be established. Reducing material costs. Many of the materials that we use in these types of products are very expensive cytokines and enzymes of sorts that need to be manufactured with a GMP grade capability. And there are other non-cell-based materials like serum and plasma and platelet lysate that are also very important. So again, the emphasis here is how do we manage the front end of the supply chain with all the materials that are necessary to manufacture the product. Logistics and transportation, as I said, we're dealing with live cells or cryopreserved cells. Certainly cryopreserving cells and transporting them does increase cost substantially. However, to a large degree, that's what people are doing today and needs to be managed properly. We cannot separate the patient treatment and manufacturing. So logistics becomes integral to getting us to make sure the information and the product are being moved between the different sites. Cold chain requirements, I think we've covered a little bit about that with cryopreservation, but there are cases where low temperature, 2 to 8 degrees centigrade, could be the requirement, but cryopreservation is clearly an element there. Time limit for unfrozen cells. Another thing that we're experiencing with some of our clients is higher levels of inventory on the materials. Since the lead times are really important, and we may need 6 to 12 months of inventory to support operations. You can't forget the fact that if we're moving product between countries, complex regulations, blood products, and biological product shipments are all being looked at as approaches to dealing with the cell and gene therapy products. And we'll talk about it in just a little bit, but patient information is also important in terms of data, the initial collection and tracking of the material to that patient. So HIPAA regulations will become also important. Finally, some coordination, collaboration, scheduling for the supply chain. Apheresis centers, are basically the place where blood is drawn for the patient product, and they have there's competition there between other blood donations and other activities happening there. So capacity at these facilities is really very impactful on the supply chain. Just-in-time scheduling and adjustments with cancellations. As I said earlier, patients may not be able to come to the apheresis center that day, and then all of a sudden they may come 2 weeks later, and that may require adjustments to the manufacturing schedule and supply chain. We also need that coordination with the manufacturing sites with their scheduling slots. Right now, many of our customers have slots been kind of dedicated because of supporting clinical operations, clinical product supply. But in the future with commercial products, that becomes a much more difficult situation to support. And finally, which will be a big part of our discussion later, is access and sharing of critical information across the supply chain. As you can imagine, each of the steps in the supply chain generates information requirements that needs to be able to do their job, but also pushes out information across the supply chain for others. So I want to kind of introduce this concept, and I know in the literature you've probably seen people talk about the ecosystem, and regenerative medicine becomes an ecosystem, but I want to kind of put a little bit more detail to that. And I apologize if you can't see the wording on the slide. That wasn't intentional, but there are different players in the ecosystem, right? Anything from academic organizations, research centers, manufacturing companies, clinical organizations, You've got other players that support with financial services and what have you. But the key here is that being part of an ecosystem is more than just being a traditional supply chain. They come from different specialized areas, right? And a lot of what we see in cell and gene therapy currently, we have small clinical companies who are, their focus is on developing a product that would have the efficacious results that we're looking for, but they may not have manufacturing or supply chain capabilities. There's a mutual dependence between those different companies so that they can actually deliver the product to those clinical sites. The interaction between manufacturing and the patients is much greater than traditional pharma. The interaction between the donor site as well as the infusion center site. The ability to change over time, the different players. You may initially start out with a CDMO to manufacture the product and eventually bring that manufacturing back into your organization. Well, that brings a lot of challenges, right, in terms of tech transfer, but also you need to be set up in such a way that you're part of that ecosystem to support information that comes from these various players. So what drives participation in the ecosystem? And this is a little bit different than, again, supply chain, typical supply chain. Individual organizations cannot do it alone. Speciality that you're looking for, what you have to offer, may be very different what other players can do. So we have subject matter experts with skills and knowledge that's specific in a scientific area or in a supply chain area. Some folks are very expert at manufacturing the product, but need help with, say, the distribution and logistics. So again, each player has some special capabilities that need to be integrated and work over time with each other. The other thing that I think is important is that there's a relationship in the ecosystem that is much more than a typical supply chain handoff. You have roles that change over the product life cycle. As I said earlier, as you move from clinical to commercial, those relationships change, but you still need the performance to occur correctly. You're sharing information at a higher level than traditional supply chain. You also share best practices over time. And the other thing is agile capability. You may be asking your manufacturing partner to increase their performance, tenfold in terms of batches. How are they going to do that? Is there different ways of doing that with different players, or do you invest in that firm for more longer term? And the final thing I think is important is the suppliers are part of the ecosystem. In this area, the materials, the raw materials, the disposables and all the consumables that you use in manufacturing become really important as part of making sure that you can deliver the product. So your suppliers become extremely important. So some critical success factors, ability to support unique product characteristics of living cells that change over the life cycle, ability to change or evolve over time to increase environmental capacity, scale up or scale out, ability to adopt new technology and automation. To assume you're going to use the same technology during early clinical and post-commercial, it's going to change over time. You're going to find improvement capabilities. Reducing the variability of some of the processes isn't going to be important. And automating it obviously helps have it be more repeatable. Sharing information, I think has been talked about quite a bit, but again, patient information, material information, manufacturing and tracking. Sufficient level of qualified vendors. Again, much of the early clinical is maybe done with laboratory grade material, but that has to evolve to GMP grade. And sufficient inventory levels to mitigate disruption or limited production capacity. Some of the materials are gotten overseas, and as we know with the coronavirus supply chain impact that we've seen over the last few weeks, that has been very impactful. So we have to consider that in the short term and in the long term, either with single sourcing or multi-sourcing capability. So what is digitalization, right? You've probably seen that term a little bit on some websites and what have you. Some people think it's the conversion of analog information into digital signals and values. Some people think it's the conversion of data into information. And some folks think it's the ability to represent the physical world with some digital representation. And all these are really needed. But I kind of adopt a little bit of a different definition here because I think it's important. And Gardner kind of used this terminology where I think is extremely important. The use of digital technologies to change a business model and provide new revenue and value-producing opportunities. So we're not just talking about technology. We're talking about how to take the correct technology and apply it to make a difference to the business. And I've used this diagram here a little bit to kind of show where we are on the spectrum of, IT orientation to more digitalization. And the big differences here, obviously, is we're focus of technology to processes to now business models, moving away from programming to more ownership, leadership of the digital condition. Engagement, mostly disengaged externally to now being more aligned with colleagues as partners in that ecosystem. And we, as a group in the ecosystem, engage with the external customer. The output is more around digital business innovation and new types of value that we can bring to the business. And if you think about cell and gene therapy, we are talking about an innovative approach that needs to think differently about how we treat folks in the ecosystem and bring them together in such a way that they can deliver that product that we're looking for the patient. The benefits of digitalization: enhanced visibility across the supply chain. We do that for alignment as well as risk mitigation. Improved demand forecasting, because we're now closer to real-time patient variability. We understand if we get more patient requests, that becomes real demand as opposed to a forecast. Enabling collaboration across the business processes that all the partners play. Improved track and trace capability. Predictive intelligence and analytics, where we take the data that is generated from the multiple sources in the supply chain and be able to provide some enhanced view of where we need to do. Timely decision-making and real-time actionability. And again, that agility to changing customers, partners, and suppliers. Because remember, as I said earlier, the ecosystem changes over time with different players at different parts of the product life cycle. All of this is important, but we always have to remember we're focused on the patient. That's really that's the major difference. Patient is the center of our efforts. So just to, again, the creating of a digital supply chain, I think it has three elements to it. Certainly the technology, the operational information technology, which a lot of people talk about, but I'm going to challenge you to think of it differently. The OT and the IT that we're talking about needs to be balanced with business processes and the organizational cultures, the different cultures of the organizations, and knowledge sharing. In order to be successful with digital supply chains, we need to have all three brought into our scope of work. The business processes, rethinking what processes we should be re-engineering. Should we rethink how we engage with the customers? How do we plan our activities? For example, with integrated business process planning with S&OPs, which is very traditional in most companies, we need to bring different players into that discussion from the apheresis and treatment centers. So that's really talking about really getting an understanding of their perspectives in the planning process. We need to consider a governance model across the supply chain, much more so than we have in the past. One organization may be the orchestrator of the process of the supply chain, but everyone needs to be part of that governance model. And we also should be thinking about lean concepts to manufacturing supply chain, how to reduce the waste and the non-value activities that are in our current supply chains. From an organizational culture perspective, We need to think about mutual understanding and participation from the different participants. We have to create a common tacit knowledge within the ecosystem that is value add for the players, because if they're not getting value from it, they may take themselves out of it. Implicit knowledge that's in a shared environment based on trust and security. We need to share all sorts of proprietary information. People are very uncomfortable with that nowadays, to share that. We need to get more comfortable and develop trust with the different players. Finally, and I think this is actually probably very, very important, maybe the top priority, is common goals and objectives and reward system. How do we develop that within the ecosystem so everyone feels that they're getting something out of the relationship? You know, if I give you a PO to send material to a particular location in the country, that's a PO, you pay them, and it's done. We're talking about developing longer-term bonding relationships. So organizations need to show that they have some commonality in what they're trying to achieve. Some considerations for the supply chain, the O&IT, the technology piece. Convergence, bringing operational technology and information technology together where you have more interaction and dependence on the capabilities that each brings is very important. Industry Internet of Things, where we're connecting specific devices and materials and supply chain greater than we ever seen before, is going to be necessary. Enabling the patient information systems into the ecosystem to share their information with manufacturing supply chain. That's a very different area than we currently have. So that'll be very important. ERP systems that most pharmaceutical companies have, well, you know, they need to evolve into more inter-organizational systems where suppliers and customers are part of that ERP system. Typically, ERP systems are single company based. Whether you're using SAP or any other ERP, it's pretty much set up as a single organization. And what I'm, I guess, proposing is that it becomes greater than an individual organization. And finally, infrastructure of data management. If you're going to share all this information across the supply chain, backup, disaster recovery, security are all important features that we need to build in order to share information across the supply chain. So how does this really apply to, how does digitalization apply to regenerative medicine? I'm going to give you some examples here. Apheresis equipment generates messages to the manufacturing site ERP system to plan the patient order. Very different, very challenging, but that's where I think we need to get to. And I actually have some of my research and my work have indicated that the equipment manufacturers are aware of that and are providing more capabilities around that. Utilizing barcodes and RFID technology to communicate with GPS to provide chain of identity and chain of custody throughout the logistics process. I think that's pretty straightforward, but, you know, we're talking about ensuring that, you know, to a larger degree, I think. Manufacturing automation, generating electronic batch records to ensure all procedures are followed and ensure proper labeling of the finished product. In many of our engagements in our organization, we're doing this, and it has a very strong perspective to ensuring that that information is integrated across not only the individual company, but across the supply chain. And finally, a shared information repository for donor collection centers, transfusion centers, hospital systems with manufacturing logistics. A couple of others, information portal, access from mobile devices to the factory floor. So whether you're working on your phone, an iPad, or your PC, having that visibility through that information portal to the various points of information across the supply chain. Utilizing predictive analytics to understand the variability seen in the process. As we gain more and more data from the supply chain, that data needs to be mined, and using techniques like artificial intelligence and other BI tools, being able to support that visibility and analysis. And finally, providing a vendor-neutral integration methodology to allow diverse organization systems to share information across the supply chain. This is an important perspective that I know there are several vendors out there that are working on trying to create this integration. but we need to think about it more holistically. In the ecosystem, if some players don't have access to that information, they are limited to participate in the ecosystem. So we need to have an ability, and there are technologies out there today that allow that to happen. So we can have a neutral vendor methodology, integration methodology. We need to think about that. So in summary, this is a tremendous opportunity to support the future of this healthcare with regenerative medicine. We need to understand, plan, and develop the supply chain as early as possible, considering the new potential business models. It's never too early to talk about this. People tend to worry about supply chain when they're really close to commercialization. I think we need to think much more differently about that. We need to think about early on, how do we bring in partners? How do we change partners over time? And how do we share information across those partners? A robust supply chain to ensure variation with the demand will have minimal impact on the availability of product at point of care. There will always be variation. We strive to minimize that, but we need to be able to deal with it in practical ways. It could be more higher level of material inventory, or multiple product containers that are maintained at the manufacturing facility in case something happens to the material that is sent to the patient, if something happens to it. The supply chain needs to have agile networks with the ecosystem, so new and changing roles of players. People can come in and out and in different roles. Maybe the same firm will change their role in an ecosystem over time. Now is the time to leverage this digitalization. This is an opportunity where the technologies are much more mature. We understand better what we need to do in this space, and I believe it can impact our product delivery and costs by doing that. And finally, I'd like you to consider the business process, organizational culture, knowledge sharing, and OT/IT investments in the early stage of regenerative medicine products. We know that that's a stretch for many organizations, but I think the opportunity are really worth the investment of looking how to plan for the future. So that's the end of my presentation. I just want to thank Exami for the opportunity to speak, Global OTIT for the support here also, and I'm leaving you here with the link to a video and link to the website for Got It. So that's what I have.
Great, Bob. Hey, thank you very, very much. Terrific presentation. I have to say, you covered a very important and complex process extremely well, and you broke it down effectively for the audience. So thank you for that. We do have a few questions from the audience, so let's get to those. But for the audience, while Bob is answering your questions, if you want to take a moment and to answer or provide any feedback, there is a feedback form that appears at the bottom of your screen. So please take a moment to go ahead and fill that out. So Bob, first question, kind of at the core of cell and gene therapies, but can you describe the difference between autologous and allogeneic supply chain?
Yeah, sure. As I indicated, autologous is same patient supply chain, where the product is the cells are retrieved from the patient and returned to the same patient, while allogeneic is a one-to-many. So we talked about vein to vein, where you have to track the material back to the same patient. But with allogeneic, it kind of models more closely to pharmaceuticals, where you have the opportunity to make a larger batch of product, potentially cryopreserving it and sending it to multiple patients around the world, so to speak. So it's a kind of a model closer to the traditional pharma. It still has much to be learned about, but the main difference is the autologous requires a special custody, chain of custody back to the same patient, and requires that information to be documented.
Gotcha. Great. Thank you very much. And And you're right, the process is evolving for sure. So another question we have is, how do the participants in the ecosystem change over time? Are there any examples that you can give us of how those participants do change?
Sure. So let's take a traditional product that's being commercialized today. I can't name the company or the product, but let's just say that the product is being commercialized and they started out with a initial contract manufacturing organization to manufacture their product. That CMO may have limitations on how much they can produce. So they may choose to tech transfer to an internal site where they manufacture the product in their own shop. So after 2 years of manufacturing at the CMO, they're going to now bring that product back into their shop, into their own organization. And so they made an investment in a manufacturing facility, getting it started up, validated and all that, and now they do that transfer. So again, it's the same company asking to make the product, but it's two different players, so to speak, manufacturing it.
Great. Okay, terrific. Got a COG question here for you. You ready?
Yeah. Oh boy. Go ahead.
Can you provide an estimate of the COGS for a pharma company or a CDMO for two things, for a cell therapy treatment and also a gene therapy treatment? And at what level do these need to fall to buy and win?
Well, that's a very complicated question. I guess, you know, a COGS perspective, these products have, you know, COGS levels that are potentially 10 to 20, maybe 50 times the cost of traditional pharma, which is composed of not only the manufacturing costs, but also the logistics, the need to handle material and special requirements, cold chain requirements, cryopreserved, needing to have various points of confirmation that all adds up to the COGS. Notwithstanding that the development support activities have to be also, accounted for. I think the gene therapy versus the cell therapy, I think the COGS could be higher or lower depending upon how you, what's the underlying technology. With the gene therapy, you're dealing with obviously trying to make genetic modifications to the cells, and if you can use a master and working cell bank to achieve that investment, it's much more appropriate from a COGS standpoint than having to have a continual genetic engineering process that you have to, maintain in the laboratory. So again, there's many different techniques of the COGS going up or down depending upon the specific process that you have. So it's kind of hard to answer if it could be higher or lower between the two.
Absolutely, it's specific to each company's position for sure. Probably a loaded question, but something that you could probably talk to the audience member offline there a little bit. One other one for you. We have time for just one more here. What do you see are the biggest links missing from the current ecosystem to enable the paradigm that you were discussing?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question again?
Sure. It goes back to the new paradigm you were referencing before. And the question is, what do you see are the biggest links missing from the current ecosystem?
Oh, yeah, sure. So I'm going to start out with probably the least tangible that people want to hear about, but it's developing a relationship of trust with each other, that you're going to have each other's backs, so to speak, in making each other successful. That's really a hard, intangible thing to talk about, but it really is important. And we all know what that is, right? It's just that, you can talk about contracts, you can talk about agreements that are set up between companies, but you've got to have a comfort level with the organizations you're dealing with. And that trust becomes the foundation for everything we're talking about. I'll give you an example. In my days at Pfizer, when I was working in external manufacturing, working with different contractors that were supporting the manufacturer of the Pfizer product, going in there and having a relationship with them that allows me to, explain to them where we have opportunities for improvement, and them trusting me that I have their best interest in mind to make that process improvement. That took a lot of effort. That doesn't just happen natural, off the bat. You have to really work it. You have to really show that you've got their interests in mind, and you really want them to improve to make sure that we're all being successful together. So I think trust is a really big piece there, and there's a lot of other things, but I think that's the number one.
Great. Well, thanks. And that's a perfect way to end today's session. And I'd like to thank you, Bob, very much for a great presentation. I'd also like to thank the audience for a terrific discussion. If we didn't get to your questions, and there are a number of them that are there, Bob of the Global OTIT team will be happy to get back to you directly. And one last piece of housekeeping before you go, if you haven't already, please take a moment to answer the feedback form that appears at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, on behalf of Xconomy and Global OTIT Quality Services, we hope you have a productive remainder of the day. So please take care and stay safe. Have a great afternoon, everybody.